Welcome to the unseen horror. Darkness lurks where you least expect it. Shadows move when no one is watching. Here, nightmares come to life, and fear has a voice. If you crave spine-chilling tales, eerie mysteries, and stories that haunt your soul long after the screen fades to black, you're in the right place. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and remember, never look behind you. Subscribe if you dare.
Tonight, we're stepping away from ghosts and ghouls. No horror stories today, but don't get too comfortable. We dive into a world of secrets, betrayal, and a mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's begin. Murder on Platform 13. The station's flickering tube lights cast long shadows, turning the platforms into eerie stretches of dimly lit concrete. Detective Aryan leaned against a cold iron pillar, waiting for the last train to arrive. He had been working a high-profile case all day, and exhaustion clung to his bones. A cigarette dangled from his fingers, its ember glowing weakly against the darkness. That was when he noticed the man on the far bench. At first glance, the man seemed to be dozing off, slouched forward, his long overcoat wrapped tightly around his body. The dim lighting made it difficult to see his face. Then Aryan saw it, the dark, thick stain slowly seeping through the fabric of the coat. Blood. Aryan's instincts kicked in. He flicked his cigarette to the ground and strode toward the man. His hand instinctively hovered over his holster as his trained eyes scanned the platform. No one had been near the man. No one had touched him. And yet, he was dying. The detective reached out, shaking the man's shoulder. The body collapsed sideways, revealing a knife buried between his ribs. His face was frozen in shock, mouth slightly open, as if his last words had died on his lips. Aryan's pulse quickened. How had the killer escaped? He turned sharply, his gaze sweeping the platform. There were only a handful of people around. Two workers loading crates into a storage room, a janitor lazily sweeping near the tracks, a couple huddled together at the far end, waiting for a delayed train. None of them seemed out of place. Then he noticed something else. The CCTV camera above the platform had stopped blinking. Aryan pulled out his phone, quickly dialing the station's control room. Kana here, check the security footage for Platform 13 right now. There was a pause, then a tense reply. Sir, the feed went down 10 minutes ago. Aryan's grip tightened on his phone. Someone had planned this. Someone had disabled the cameras before the murder. The realization sent a chill down his spine. The murderer was either gone, or worse, watching him right now. Murder at the railway station. The station remained eerily quiet, the murmurs of onlookers drowned out by the detective's thoughts. He stood beside the lifeless body, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the crime scene. Something wasn't right. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no blood splatter beyond the immediate area. If the victim had been stabbed here, wouldn't there have been some resistance? A scream, a reflexive attempt to fight back. But there was nothing. The detective crouched, examining the body closer. His mind raced through possibilities. The stab was too precise. A single, expertly placed wound that caused instant death. The killer knew anatomy well. A doctor, a butcher, someone trained to end a life with one fatal move. The victim knew the killer. There was no fear in his eyes, no signs of surprise frozen in his expression. Had the murderer been someone familiar? A friend, a colleague? Did they exchange words before the fatal strike? The attack happened elsewhere, in a bustling station filled with people. A murder like this couldn't have gone unnoticed. Could the body have been moved here? If so, where was the real crime scene? The lack of a blood trail suggested careful planning. Whoever did this was methodical, precise. The murderer knew exactly what they were doing. A paralyzing agent. Could the victim have been drugged first? Poisoned. His skin showed no immediate puncture wounds, but a more detailed autopsy could reveal traces of something sinister. The detective exhaled slowly. Each theory led to more questions than answers. He scanned the crowd, eyes darting between the faces of commuters and bystanders. Was the murderer still here, blending in, watching him piece it all together? Or had they already vanished into the night? Snapping out of his thoughts, the detective reached for his phone and called forensics. I need a full examination of the crime scene immediately, he instructed. The forensic team arrived swiftly, setting up a perimeter as uniformed officers controlled the crowd, pushing curious onlookers back. The lead forensic investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Meera Sinha, approached the detective. "We've examined the knife," she said, pulling off her gloves. "No fingerprints, no smudges. Completely clean." The detective's brow furrowed. "Gloves?" "Doctor." Meera nodded. "Most likely. Whoever did this was careful. No skin cells, no sweat residue, nothing." One of her assistants approached with a report. "We checked the surrounding area. No footprints, no discarded items, no sign of a struggle. If there was a fight, it didn't happen here." The detective glanced at the body, then back at the forensic team. "So, no usable evidence?" Meera hesitated before replying. "Nothing so far, but we'll keep looking." The detective sighed, scanning the station. A crowded place, a perfect alibi for many. And yet, not a single clue to point him in the right direction. Whoever the killer was, they hadn't just vanished. They had erased their presence completely, and that made them dangerous. The detective ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the sea of people beyond the barricade. Even with officers keeping them back, the station remained chaotic, commuters still pushing through, conversations buzzing, footsteps echoing. He turned to Dr. Meera, exhaling sharply. "Even if there was any evidence, chances are it's already gone." A place like this, he gestured at the bustling station. Hundreds of people walking through, stepping over everything. If the killer left anything behind, it's been trampled over a dozen times by now. "Doctor." Meera crossed her arms, nodding grimly. "You're right. This isn't a controlled crime scene, it's a disaster. Any trace evidence, footprints, even small fibers could be long gone." The detective scanned the area again. The killer had planned this. Not just the murder itself, but the escape. They knew the station would work in their favor, that the crowd would erase their tracks for them. That meant they weren't impulsive. This wasn't random, this was calculated, and that raised the most unsettling question of all. Had the killer chosen this spot because they knew no one would ever find out who they were? The detective took a deep breath, his mind racing through every possibility. The forensic team had done their best, but with no fingerprints, no murder weapon beyond the wiped clean knife, and no solid evidence left behind, they were hitting dead ends. He turned to one of the officers. "We need to check the security cameras. If the killer was careful enough to erase prints, they still couldn't have avoided being seen on the station's CCTV." The officer nodded and quickly made a call to the control room. Meanwhile, the detective's eyes scanned the station once more. So many people, so many faces. The murderer could have walked right past him. Or maybe they were still here, standing among the crowd, watching everything unfold. A few minutes later, an officer approached him. "Sir, there's a problem." The detective narrowed his eyes. "What kind of problem?" "The cameras. Something's wrong with the footage. The feed from the last hour is missing." Silence. A sharp, heavy kind of silence. The detective clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a lucky break for the killer. This was deliberate. Someone had tampered with the footage. Whoever did this had planned everything to perfection. The detective crouched near the body as the forensic team finished their examination. One of the officers approached him, shaking his head. "No wallet, no phone, no ID." The detective exhaled slowly. "So, we don't even know who the victim is." The officer nodded grimly. "Nothing in his pockets, not even a scrap of paper. Whoever did this didn't just want to kill him, they wanted to erase him." The realization sent a chill through the detective. This wasn't a random murder. This was calculated, precise. The killer had stripped the victim of anything that could lead to his identity, as if mocking the police, challenging them to work harder, to struggle to even find out who had died. The detective glanced at the body again. Young man, well-dressed, but no ring, no watch, nothing personal. No signs of a robbery either. His clothes were undisturbed, his pockets empty but not turned inside out. The killer wasn't after money. They wanted something else. A message, a delay, or was this victim chosen for a reason? The detective's grip tightened around his pen. The killer was playing a game. And he had just made his first move. The morgue smelled of antiseptic and cold steel. The detective stood beside the forensic doctor as the body lay on the table, lifeless and still, a stark reminder of how little they knew. The doctor adjusted his gloves and pulled the sheet down, revealing the victim's pale arm. "We found something unusual." The detective narrowed his eyes. "Unusual how?" "There was poison in his system." The words hit like a hammer. Poison. That changed everything. It wasn't ingested, the doctor continued. It entered through his skin, likely through his fingertips. The detective's mind raced, which means, he touched something laced with it. The doctor nodded. Exactly. A newspaper, a phone, a water bottle, something he held, maybe for just a few minutes. The poison absorbed through his skin, making him lose consciousness. He gestured toward the stab wound. By the time he was stabbed, he was probably already out cold. He never even saw it coming. The detective crossed his arms. So, the killer didn't just strike randomly. They planned this. The poison ensured there was no struggle, no resistance. The stab was just to finish the job. Any idea what kind of poison? The detective asked. We're still running tests, but it had to be fast-acting. The moment he touched it, he had minutes, maybe seconds, before he blacked out. The detective exhaled. This wasn't a simple murder. It was an execution. And worse, the killer had gone through extreme lengths to make it happen. He clenched his jaw. Someone out there had planned this meticulously. And they weren't afraid to do it again. It took hours of sifting through missing persons reports, comparing facial features, and digging through databases, but finally, the police identified the victim. His name was Rahul Mehta, a 38-year-old accountant working for a private firm in the city. No criminal record, no suspicious activity, just an ordinary man with an ordinary life, until now. The police called his family, and soon, his wife and younger brother arrived at the station. The detective watched as they entered, grief evident in their tear-filled eyes. He gave them a moment before starting the questioning. Did he have any enemies? The detective asked, his tone firm but calm. His wife shook her head, wiping her tears. No, Rahul was a good man. He never had any fights or disputes with anyone. The younger brother leaned forward. He wasn't involved in anything dangerous. He went to work, came home, spent time with us. That's it. I can't imagine who would want to do this to him. The detective studied them carefully. Were they telling the truth, or were they hiding something? But their grief seemed genuine. Either they really didn't know, or the enemy Rahul had was one he never spoke about. With no leads from the family, the next step was clear, his workplace. The detective arrived at Rahul's office the next morning, his badge earning him reluctant cooperation from the management. He questioned colleagues, supervisors, and even the security guards. Was Rahul behaving strangely lately? Did he mention anything about someone following him? Any disputes at work, arguments, problems with money? But nothing. He was quiet, always focused on his work, one coworker said. Never had any fights or conflicts, another added. Even his boss had nothing but good things to say. The detective sighed, rubbing his temple. Rahul Mehta was a man with no known enemies, no apparent troubles, and no suspicious activities. And yet, someone had gone to extreme lengths to kill him. Why? The detective needed a new lead. He was running in circles, and the killer was still out there, maybe already planning their next move. The detective sat at his desk, both crime scene reports spread out before him. 2 victims, same murder method, no struggle, no evidence, and now, a taunting note from the killer. This was no random act. There had to be a connection. He leaned back, eyes flickering between the victims' photos. The first man had been identified days ago, an accountant, no known enemies, no suspicious history. The second victim, another ordinary man, a schoolteacher. Completely different professions, no shared workplaces, no known mutual friends. So why were they both killed the same way? The detective picked up the phone and dialed his team. I want full background checks on both victims. I need to know every place they've been in the last month. Where they ate, where they shopped, any events they attended. There's something tying them together, we just haven't found it yet. Hanging up, he grabbed his coat. There was one more thing bothering him. The note. You're looking in the wrong place. What if he had been? He turned back to the board where all the case details were pinned. Was it possible the killer wasn't targeting the victims at all? Maybe the connection wasn't between the 2 dead men. Maybe the connection was something they had both seen. Or worse, someone they both knew. And if that was the case, then whoever it was, could be next. The next morning, the detective walked into the precinct, where his team had spent the night digging into the victims' backgrounds. A large whiteboard had been set up, filled with notes, timelines, and photos of both men, Rahul Mehta, the accountant, and Vikram Malhotra, the schoolteacher. A young officer handed him a thick file. Sir, we've compiled everything. Both men lived in different parts of the city. They never worked together, never lived in the same neighborhood. No overlapping bank transactions, no shared phone records, nothing unusual in their recent activity. The detective frowned. There had to be something. Another officer added, "We went through their social media, no mutual friends, no common interactions." Frustrated, the detective flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning for anything. Two completely different lives, yet killed in the same way. Then, just as he was about to close the file, something caught his attention. Wait, these two men were in the same place on the same day. The room fell silent. He held up two separate bank statements, one from Vikram and one from Rahul. Both men had made a transaction at the same cafe, on the same date, at nearly the same time. 3 days before Vikram was murdered, the detective murmured. His mind started racing. Was this a coincidence, or had something happened at that cafe that tied these two men together? The detectives arrived at Heaven on Earth, a cozy yet upscale cafe nestled in a bustling part of the city. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, but for them, this wasn't a casual visit, it was a crime scene in disguise. Detective Aryan and his partner, Inspector Ravi, stepped inside, flashing their badges at the manager. Aryan, we're investigating a murder case. Two men, Rahul Mehta and Vikram Malhotra, were here 3 days ago. We need to know if anything unusual happened that day. The manager, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a nervous demeanor, furrowed his brows. Manager, Rahul Mehta, Vikram Malhotra, let me check our records. We usually don't keep tabs on customers unless they've made reservations or paid by card. He walked over to the counter and tapped into the system. Meanwhile, Aryan and Ravi scanned the cafe, observing the tables, the crowd, and the placement of security cameras. The manager returned with a nod. Manager, yes, both of them were here that day, and at the same time. Rahul Mehta arrived at 4:15 p.m., and Vikram Malhotra walked in around 4:30 p.m. They both stayed for nearly an hour and left within minutes of each other. Ravi, were they sitting together? The manager hesitated before answering. Manager, no, but they weren't far apart. Rahul was at a corner table near the window, and Vikram sat 2 tables away. They didn't seem to talk to each other directly, but the detectives leaned in. Aryan, but what? The manager frowned. Manager, there was something odd. They weren't sitting together, but at one point, they both looked at the same person, almost at the same time. A man in a gray hoodie sitting at a table between them. He was here for about 40 minutes, kept looking at his phone, barely touched his drink, and left right before they did. Aryan and Ravi exchanged glances. A third person, someone who had caught the attention of both victims. Aryan, we need the CCTV footage. Now. The cafe manager nodded and led them to the back. A new lead had just emerged. He grabbed his coat and turned to his team. We're going to that cafe. The killer wanted them to work harder. Fine. But now, they were getting close. The detectives arrived at Heaven on Earth, a cozy yet upscale cafe nestled in a bustling part of the city. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, but for them, this wasn't a casual visit, it was a crime scene in disguise. Detective Aryan and his partner, Inspector Ravi, stepped inside, flashing their badges at the manager. Aryan, we're investigating a murder case. Two men, Rahul Mehta and Vikram Malhotra, were here 3 days ago. We need to know if anything unusual happened that day. The manager, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a nervous demeanor, furrowed his brows. Manager, Rahul Mehta, Vikram Malhotra, let me check our records. We usually don't keep tabs on customers unless they've made reservations or paid by card. He walked over to the counter and tapped into the system. Meanwhile, Aryan and Ravi scanned the cafe, observing the tables, the crowd, and the placement of security cameras. The manager returned with a nod. Manager, yes, both of them were here that day, and at the same time. Rahul Mehta arrived at 4:15 p.m., and Vikram Malhotra walked in around 4:30 p.m. They both stayed for nearly an hour and left within minutes of each other. Ravi, were they sitting together? The manager hesitated before answering. Manager, no, but they weren't far apart. Rahul was at a corner table near the window, and Vikram sat 2 tables away. They didn't seem to talk to each other directly, but the detectives leaned in. Aryan, but what? The manager frowned. Manager, there was something odd. They weren't sitting together, but at one point, they both looked at the same person, almost at the same time. A man in a gray hoodie sitting at a table between them. He was here for about 40 minutes, kept looking at his phone, barely touched his drink, and left right before they did. Aryan and Ravi exchanged glances. A third person, someone who had caught the attention of both victims. Aryan, we need the CCTV footage. Now. The cafe manager nodded and led them to the back. A new lead had just emerged. The detective leaned forward, eyes fixed on the grainy CCTV footage playing before him. The dimly lit cafe, the scattered tables, the steady hum of customers, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, there he was. A man in a dark hoodie, sitting alone at a corner table. His shoulders were tense, his fingers gripping his phone tightly. He had ordered a drink, but it remained untouched. His body language screamed anxiety, fear, like he was waiting for something. Then came the real twist. Rahul Mehta and Vikram Malhotra. They weren't sitting together, and yet, they weren't exactly strangers either. Both of them kept glancing at the hooded man. And then it happened. Rahul, subtle but deliberate, tilted his head slightly toward Vikram. A silent message, check his phone. Vikram shifted in his seat, angling himself carefully. His eyes darted toward the screen in the hoodie man's hands. He wasn't just curious, he was analyzing something. The detective's mind raced. Rahul and Vikram, how did they know each other? What did they see on that phone that had both of them dead shortly after? And the hooded man, was he the next victim? Or the killer himself? The officers in the room exchanged glances. The footage had changed everything. Sir, an officer spoke up, clearing his throat. This means the murders weren't random. The detective nodded, his jaw clenched. This wasn't some personal grudge. Rahul and Vikram were onto something. And whatever it was, it got them killed. The room fell into silence. Somewhere out there, a murderer was still walking free. And worse, so was the truth. The detective wasn't one to believe in coincidences. Two men murdered within days of each other. No direct connection on paper, yet both found in the same cafe, silently exchanging signals. And now this. Both of them had joined their respective workplaces exactly 4 months ago. Rahul Mehta, the quiet accountant, had been hired at his firm 4 months ago. Vikram Malhotra, the well-respected schoolteacher, had started teaching at St. Mary's 4 months ago. This was no accident. This was planned. The detective sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, across from Rahul's manager. The man was sweating, nervous, tapping his fingers against the table. How well did you know Rahul? The detective asked, voice sharp, eyes locked onto him. The manager swallowed hard. He was professional, kept to himself mostly, did his job well, no complaints. The detective leaned forward. Tell me, in those 4 months, did he ever seem out of place? Like he was doing more than just accounting? A pause, a flicker of hesitation. Well, the manager exhaled. Now that you mention it, Rahul asked a lot of questions. About old records. Financial reports from 5, even 10 years ago. It was weird, but I thought he was just curious. The detective's jaw tightened. Did he ever mention Vikram Malhotra? The manager frowned. No, never heard that name before. The detective turned to his assistant. Bring in Vikram's school principal. Now, half an hour later, Vikram's principal sat in the same chair, mirroring the same nervous energy. Mr. Malhotra was a wonderful teacher, she insisted. The kids loved him. I can't imagine why anyone would hurt him. The detective exhaled, nodding. He joined 4 months ago. Did anything strange happen after he arrived? The principal hesitated. Well, now that you mention it, he kept asking about old student records. Even ones from students who left years ago. I didn't think much of it, but it was odd. The detective's mind was racing now. Rahul was digging into old financial records. Vikram was looking into past students. Both men joined their jobs at the same time. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. Rahul and Vikram were onto something. Something big. And whatever it was, it got them killed. The detective stood in the dimly lit surveillance room, eyes fixed on the grainy footage playing before him. The man in the hoodie was their only lead now. Everything pointed back to him. The video showed him sitting at the cafe table, his fingers gripping his phone tightly. His body language screamed tension, eyes flickering, hands trembling, shoulders hunched as if waiting for something. But most importantly, he never touched his drink. Rahul Mehta and Vikram Malhotra had both noticed him. The footage clearly showed them exchanging glances. Rahul, tilting his head ever so slightly toward Vikram, a silent signal. A signal that said, check his phone. The detective rewound the footage, watching the moment again. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was a mission. Pause there, he ordered. The screen froze. The man in the hoodie had his phone tilted just enough. A faint reflection on the glossy cafe window showed something, a chat window, maybe. A photo, a video. The detective's fingers drummed against the table. Can we enhance that? One of the officers sighed. Not enough clarity. We'd need the original phone. And that was the problem. Who was this man? Where was he now? And what was so important on that phone that two men had to die for it? The detective clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. This was a hunt. The city went into lockdown. Every police jurisdiction had been alerted, checkpoints were set up, and officers searched cars, buses, trucks, anything that moved. The detective was sure the hooded man wouldn't get far. But by the end of the day, they had nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. No sightings, no leads. The frustration was evident on the detective's face as he sat in his office, staring at the grainy image of the man on the cafe footage. Who was he? Where did he go? And what the hell was he so afraid of? Then, late into the night, his phone rang. The moment he picked up, he knew it wasn't good news. The officer on the other end spoke in a grave tone. Sir, we found a body. Near the sewers. Male, mid-30s. And, there was a pause. He matches the profile of our hoodie guy. The detective shot up from his chair. The one man who could have given them answers, was now dead. Someone was cleaning up, tying loose ends. The detective rushed to the crime scene, finding the same grim pattern. No evidence, no prints, no witnesses. It was as if the killer had struck with the same precision as before. But this time, the setting was different. Not a crowded railway station. Not a place where people came and went. This body had been dumped near the sewers, left there deliberately. Why? Because the killer knew. They knew that if the hooded man had been caught, if the police had questioned him, he would have cracked. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated move. The detective looked at the lifeless face of the only lead they had. A man who had spent his final moments glued to his phone, terrified. And now, just like the others, he was gone. As the detective stepped into his office, he immediately sensed the tension in the air. Two men were waiting for him. One was his boss. The other, a man in a crisp suit with an expression that could freeze fire, was someone he had never met before. But the weight of his presence was enough to tell the detective that this was not an ordinary visit. Sit, his boss ordered, his tone firm. The detective took his seat, waiting for an explanation. The man in the suit finally spoke. I am from Ra. We need to talk about Rahul Mehta and Vikram Malhotra. The detective leaned forward. Here it comes. They are not who you think they are, the Ra official continued. Rahul and Vikram were our agents. Their real identities are classified, but they were working an undercover mission. The detective's jaw tightened. Undercover? For what? The official didn't flinch. They were here to find someone. Someone dangerous. We placed them under aliases. Rahul is an accountant, Vikram is a school teacher. It was the perfect cover. The detective exhaled slowly. This changed everything. This wasn't just a random murder anymore. Rahul and Vikram weren't just victims. They were targets. The room fell silent after the Ra agent's revelation. The detective processed everything carefully, his mind piecing together the puzzle at a rapid pace. But something was missing. Who were Rahul and Vikram looking for? Why were they here? He leaned forward. What was their mission? Who were they after? The Ra agent's expression didn't change. That information is classified. This is an internal matter now. We're shutting down this investigation. You will hand over everything you've found so far. The detective let out a bitter chuckle. You're joking, right? The Ra agent's jaw tightened. This isn't up for debate. You're out. The detective's eyes darkened. He stood up, placing both hands on the table. He wasn't backing down. Two of your agents were murdered right under your nose. And if that wasn't bad enough, now a civilian is dead, someone you don't even recognize. You think you have control over this? You don't. This killer is ahead of all of us. The Ra agent narrowed his eyes but said nothing. The detective continued, voice unwavering. You want me to step aside? Fine, I would have. But now, a civilian, someone who wasn't part of your game, was killed. That makes this my case. And I don't care who you work for, I'm not stopping. A tense silence followed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Ra agent exhaled through his nose and gave a reluctant nod. All right, but you report to me now. The detective smirked. Sure. As long as you don't keep me in the dark. The game had changed. Now, it was a war. The air in the room grew heavier as the raw agent finally spoke. 5 months ago, he began, someone from inside our system leaked classified information, government secrets that no one outside should have ever known. Because of that leak, some of our best operatives were compromised and executed. The detective folded his arms. He had suspected something bigger was at play, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. Ra had received intel that the traitor, the one who had sold out his country, was hiding in the same city where Rahul Mehta and Vikram Malhotra had been stationed. Their mission was simple: find the mole, capture him alive, and bring him back for interrogation. But something went wrong, the detective muttered. The Ra agent nodded grimly. They got killed before they could complete their mission. Someone got to them first. The detective ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. And now, the one person who could have connected the dots, the hoodie guy, is dead too. Silence settled over the room. Then, the detective pulled out a small evidence bag and placed it on the table. Inside it was a pen drive. The Ra agent's eyes widened. Where did you get this? The civilian, the hoodie guy, the detective said, voice steady. He swallowed it before he died. The Ra agent inhaled sharply, realization dawning. The hoodie guy had known he wouldn't make it out alive. He had prepared for his own death. The detective leaned forward, his voice low. Whatever's on this drive, it's what got him killed. The detective and the Ra agent plugged the pendrive into a secure system. 2 files appeared on the screen. A video file, the final message from the hoodie man. A document, possibly containing the critical intel meant for Rahul and Vikram. The detective clicked on the video first. A dimly lit face appeared on the screen, the hoodie man. His eyes darted around nervously, sweat glistening on his forehead. His voice was hurried, almost trembling. If you're watching this, it means I'm dead. The detective and the Ra agent exchanged glances. The man on the screen swallowed hard before continuing. Rahul and Vikram were supposed to meet me at the cafe. They came, but I couldn't give them the pendrive. Someone was watching me. If I had handed it over, we all would have died right there. He took a shaky breath, glancing over his shoulder in the video. I messaged them instead, told them to leave separately, not together. It would be too obvious otherwise. I said I'd meet them at a different location. A short pause. The man looked straight into the camera, his expression grim. But someone knew. Someone found out about them. And now they're dead. The video glitched slightly before he leaned in closer. They killed them, took their phones, probably trying to find what we were working on. But they won't find anything. We never used normal communication. A slight smirk crossed his face, despite his fear. We used a game, a simple mobile game, a chat feature inside it. No one would suspect a thing. No one could track it. That's where we exchanged messages. The screen went black. For a moment, the room was silent. The detective felt a surge of adrenaline. This changed everything. Without wasting another second, he clicked on the second file. A document opened. It contained a list of names, locations, and transaction details, a complete breakdown of how classified government secrets were being leaked. Rahul and Vikram were hunting a traitor within the system. And now, the detective had the very evidence that could expose them. But the real question was, who else was watching, and how far would they go to keep this secret buried? The detective sat in his dimly lit office, the pendrive still plugged into his laptop. The weight of the revelation pressed on him. Rahul and Vikram had recruited a hacker, a man outside of Ra's system, someone who wasn't officially connected to them but had become their asset. The last part of the video provided the final piece of the puzzle. My name is Vicky. If you're watching this, they got to me too. But I need you to know, I wasn't a traitor. I never was. The detective watched as Vicky rubbed his face, clearly exhausted and scared. A few years ago, Rahul and Vikram caught me. I was just messing around, hacking traffic lights, making everything green at the same time. Stupid, I know. He let out a weak chuckle before continuing. But they didn't arrest me. They gave me a choice. Stop the nonsense and work with them when they needed me. I took the deal. The video cut to a shaky recording of Vicky's screen, showing him typing rapidly. A few months ago, they reached out. They were looking for someone dangerous. They had names, places, but no proof. That's where I came in. I started digging, hacking into systems, looking for the leak. His voice became urgent. I found it. It was bad. Someone inside was selling secrets. Rahul and Vikram were close to catching him. But the moment I uncovered the final piece, I knew I was screwed. Someone was watching me too. The video feed distorted slightly before stabilizing. I thought I could shake them off. I was wrong. And now, they're erasing everyone involved. Vicky leaned closer to the camera. His eyes burned with intensity. Detective, I don't know who you are. But if you've got this, finish what they started. You don't have family, you don't have friends, that makes you the only one who can see this through without fear. They can't use anyone against you. The screen went dark. The detective exhaled, his mind racing. The leak was real. Rahul, Vikram, and Vicky had uncovered it. And now, someone was cleaning up all the loose ends. And that meant, he was next. The detective sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew. The pieces fit perfectly now. The pattern of the murders. The method. The cover-ups. The killer and the traitor were the same person. Rahul and Vikram had been placed undercover because Ra suspected someone in this city was leaking government secrets. But they got too close. And that meant whoever they were after was high up, someone with access, someone powerful enough to erase people without leaving a trace. The way the victims were killed, poison first, then a stab wound, was meant to make it look like a simple murder while ensuring the victims couldn't fight back. The lack of evidence at the crime scenes wasn't just luck, it was a professional's work. The killer knew police procedures, how forensic teams operated, how intelligence agencies functioned. And then there was Vicky. The hacker, the wild card. He wasn't supposed to be part of the equation, which was why his death was rushed. The killer didn't have time to stage it perfectly like the others. That was the mistake. The detective took out a file and flipped through it. 4 months ago, that's when Rahul and Vikram started working their covers. And exactly 4 months ago, a senior intelligence officer was transferred to this city. Someone with access to government information, someone who knew the agency's inner workings, someone who would know if 2 undercover agents were placed on their trail. His hands tightened into fists. The killer was an intelligence officer. And he had a name. The detective picked up his phone and dialed. "Sir, I know who the traitor is." Detective sat in his office, the dim light casting long shadows across his face. His superior, Commissioner Raghavan, stood by the window, arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. Next to him, the raw official who had initially warned Aryan off the case now looked tense, as if bracing for impact. Aryan took a deep breath and placed the pendrive on the table. "Aryan, we have our traitor. It's DCP Arvind Khanna." The room went silent. Raghavan's eyes narrowed. The raw official flinched but said nothing. "Raghavan, you better have solid proof before accusing one of our own." Aryan tapped the pendrive. The files Vicky hid inside his body contained records of leaked intelligence, travel logs, and encrypted bank transactions. The funds Arvind received, direct transfers from a shell company linked to foreign intelligence. Ra's man clenched his fists. "Ra officer. That son of a, he played us. He was placed here just months before Rahul and Vikram arrived. He must have found out about their operation and silenced them before they could act." Aryan. "Exactly. He's methodical. No prints, no traces. Even Vicky's murder was carefully planned to tie up loose ends." Raghavan exhaled sharply. "So how do we take him down?" Aryan leaned forward. "We create one last loose end. One that he can't ignore. The trap. The plan was simple. Lure Arvind out by making him believe another hacker had the information. They brought in Kabir, a brilliant but unpredictable hacker with ties to cyber intelligence. His job, to send a fake message to Arvind, making it look like Vicky had a backup of the files and had already transferred them to someone else. Kabir cracked his knuckles and grinned. "You guys are crazy. I like it." He typed the message. "I have the files. Vicky gave them to me for safety. If anything happens to me, they go public. Let's talk." The bait was set, waiting for the killer. Arvind would do what he had done before, eliminate the last loose end. But this time, the police would be waiting. Kabir was stationed in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. A tactical unit, dressed in plain clothes, blended into the surroundings. Aryan, armed and ready, hid in the shadows. Now, all they had to do was wait. And soon, the hunter would become the hunted. The night was heavy with anticipation. An abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts stood in eerie silence, its cracked windows barely reflecting the dim streetlights. Shadows danced along the rusted metal walls as the deal of betrayal unfolded. Detective Aryan remained hidden in the darkness, his sharp eyes locked on the two figures standing near a wooden crate in the center of the space. His heartbeat was steady, his grip on his gun firm. This was it, the moment they had worked for. Kabir stood in the middle, playing his part perfectly. His laptop rested on the crate, glowing faintly in the dim light. A smirk played on his lips as he watched the man walking toward him, the man they had been hunting all this time. DCP Arvind Khanna. The very man who had sworn to uphold justice, now exposed as the traitor who sold his country's secrets. A man who had sent two raw agents to their deaths without a flicker of remorse. Arvind moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His leather shoes barely made a sound against the concrete floor as he approached Kabir. "You took a risk calling me, Kabir," Arvind said in a cold, measured tone. "That's not like you." Kabir chuckled, shaking his head as he tapped the crate. "Desperate times, my friend. You want the files or not?" Arvind didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick envelope, and tossed it onto the crate. The weight of the cash hit the wood with a dull thud. "There's your money. Now, where's the drive?" Kabir picked up the envelope, flipping through the crisp bills with an amused grin. "I gotta say, DCP, I never thought I'd see you in this position. A man of the law, buying his way out of trouble." Arvind's face remained impassive. "Give me the damn drive." Kabir sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "Vicky was right about you." That was the last thing he said before the gunshot rang out. The sound of the bullet echoed through the warehouse as Kabir's body jerked backward, the impact sending him crashing against the crate. Blood spattered across the floor as he collapsed, unmoving. His laptop slid onto the ground, the screen flickering. Arvind exhaled, lowering his gun slightly. "Amateurs." He bent down to pick up the laptop. Then came the voice. "Step away from the laptop, DCP." The shadows shifted. From every corner of the warehouse, figures emerged, plainclothes officers, tactical units, all armed and ready. The red dots of their laser sights focused on Arvind's chest like tiny death warrants. And stepping forward from the darkness was Detective Aryan. Arvind's jaw clenched. His mind raced. "You planned this," he said, voice steady but eyes darting. Aryan nodded. "You were always one step ahead, covering your tracks. No evidence, no prints, no loose ends. But you made one mistake." He pointed to Kabir's motionless body. "You thought you were the smartest man in the room." Arvind scoffed. "And what does that make you, detective?" Then, a sound, a groan. Arvind's expression froze as his eyes flicked back to the body on the ground. Kabir was moving. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his head tilting slightly as he grinned. "Damn, that hurt." He winced, pulling up his shirt to reveal a bulletproof vest smeared with fake blood. Arvind's eyes widened. "No." Before he could react, officers swarmed him, slamming him against the crate and forcing his hands behind his back. His gun clattered to the ground as cuffs clicked around his wrists. Aryan stepped closer, watching the man struggle. "You thought you could clean up your mess, but you underestimated us." Kabir dusted himself off, smirking. "Nice shot, though. You had me worried for a second." Arvind gritted his teeth, his expression no longer calm. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won, but you don't know what you're up against." Aryan leaned in, his voice cold. "Then I'll keep digging." As Arvind was dragged away by the officers, sirens filled the air outside. The hunt was over, but the war had just begun. The case was closed. The traitor was caught. Justice was served. Detective Aryan sat in his office, staring at the city lights through his window. A rare moment of peace. The storm had passed, or so he thought. But then, he remembered the traitor's last words before being dragged away in cuffs. "This isn't the end." A shiver crawled up his spine. He brushed it off. Just a desperate man's bluff. Nothing more. Or was it? 3 days later, as Aryan returned to his office, a plain white envelope sat on his desk. No sender, no markings, just his name, typed in bold. Frowning, he opened it. Inside was a single note, letters cut from magazines and newspapers, glued together with eerie precision. It read, "You think it's over. It hasn't even begun." His pulse quickened, and just below the message, a Polaroid. A photo of himself, taken from outside his apartment. Last night, someone was watching him. The nightmare wasn't over, it was only just beginning.